All right. Hey, welcome back. Having conversations at Road to Majority Faith and Freedom Coalition Summit here in Nashville. And I'm joined by legendary professor, author, communicator, entrepreneur, political science guru, Dr. Carol Swain. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much.
Great to have you. So, talking a little bit about the past 2 years, I think there's been this mainstreaming in America where parents are finally coming to this understanding of what critical race theory is about. But we've only kind of really hit the tip of the iceberg. It's much, much deeper. Cultural Marxism in all its various expressions. We see it in queer theory, other things like that. Obviously, it was a legal theory a long time ago, before it became race theory, and before that, it was critical theory proper with Herbert Marcuse and all of those. So I just want to talk a little bit about getting this to go mainstream and understanding how malevolent and pernicious this evil is.
Well, first of all, many parents first became aware of it after the COVID lockdowns or during those lockdowns, but it's been around much longer. Like I was a university professor at Princeton first for 10 years and then Vanderbilt for 18 years. So I've been in academia, and of course I went through the university system.
Yes.
Well, when I was a student, a graduate student, I was introduced to those theories, and you had professors, some were conservative, some were liberal. If you wanted to study Marxism, you took a course with one of those professors. And for the most part, critical theory, the umbrella critical theory with the Marxist roots and all of that, it was in the philosophy and political science departments.
Yes.
But I watched, over the years, first as a student. Now, when I was a student, it was very clear that there were some professors, that lean left. There were some that called themselves Marxists, but you sort of had a range. You had liberals and conservatives. Okay, you fast forward 1990s. I took my first position as a professor, assistant professor at Princeton, and there were people that were deeply into critical theory and postmodernism. But again, mostly it seemed to be in certain departments. But over the years, I watched how it sort of morphed, how it began to affect every field and sector of the university. And as far as the indoctrination, some of that came about, and it was meant to help racial and ethnic minorities and women. They started requiring students to be culturally competent.
Right.
And so they had to take, even if you were a science student, business student, regardless of your field, to graduate, you had to take so many credits for your cultural competency. Well, that was part of the soft indoctrination regime. By the time I left academia in 2017, it was everywhere.
Wow.
I mean, we had gotten to the point of the gender pronouns. We had gotten to the point where you had your safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and the political correctness had gotten to the point where it was more challenging, to be a professor. The students were coming to the university totally indoctrinated. Already, they had the answers to all the great, questions of the Western world that people had struggled with. They came in as freshmen already having resolved those things because many of them had already been indoctrinated. And I saw it getting worse, I would say, during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
And it started seeping first to the departments of education that turn out our teachers, the ed schools. They were among the first to be indoctrinated. And I have a friend who was a professor of education. She would say that the changes started in the 70s. And so it has seeped down to K through 12. It wrecked and destroyed the university. I would say the university system is pretty much over in the sense that universities were at one time seen as marketplaces of ideas.
Right.
And you know that universities themselves, that it was the church They were set up to train ministers.
That's
You
right.
know, Harvard, Yale, Princeton,
Right.
the first universities in our nation. It was the Christian idea, the idea of the university, and they believed in the life of the mind, the pursuit of knowledge, and that ultimately led to their destruction, I would say, because they were able to welcome the Marxist ideas, they welcomed ideas, and they made compromises, and here we are, that dangerous ideology that they allowed to take over the university system, destroy the university system. Now it's in our K through 12 schools. Now it's in the U.S. military. Now it's everywhere.
You know, it's amazing, Dr. Swain, how many people in the mainstream media, they're afraid now of CRT because, you know, I think the conservative side has won on this. And so they want to veer away. And they say things like, oh, that's not being taught in schools. That's a really complex legal theory. They're not teaching that to young.
Well, they're lying.
Yeah.
They are lying. And I can tell you that last year I published a co-authored book, Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. And it's a short book, about 150 pages, and part of that is the appendices, the citations, but explains what critical race theory is, where it came from, how it impacts our society, why it's anti-Christian, why it's anti-American, why it runs counter to our civil rights laws and our Constitution. The book also has 2 chapters on how to fight back. And what they have done is you take something like Action Civics.
Yes.
And there's a bill in Congress that's pending where they're supposed to teach our children about civics. It's pure CRT.
Yes.
And then they say, no, we're not doing CRT. We're doing culturally sensitive learning. No, we're not doing CRT. We're doing civil rights. But their civil rights version is all anti-white. And when it talks about the civil rights movement, if it talks about it at all, it demonizes white people, and it doesn't tell the true story that America's civil rights movement was a beautiful moment in our nation's history where people came together across racial and religious lines, and we decided what kind of nation we wanted to be, and we decided that we would be equal under the law. And so there were 3 major civil rights acts passed during the 1960s that ended discrimination by law, and the discrimination that existed after that has been individual discrimination, but under the law we were supposed to be equal. Now there's been a total reversal because we have our government pushing policies and making demands that result in discrimination against white people. Total reversal. And what they have done is really harmed racial and ethnic minorities because they're pushing for lowered standards. When you have people that are pushing on the school system the idea that math is racist,
yeah,
and that I, as a black person, I might get a different answer to an equation than you as a white person, and that you have to accept my answer. My answer is equally valid as your answer. They are destroying the lives of young people because during my era, we sought equal opportunity, non-discrimination, and in equal opportunity means you had an opportunity to succeed, but also an opportunity to fail. If you went to a college, you were expected to meet the same standards as everyone else. When they're saying that standards can be lowered for racial and ethnic minorities, they may get a different answer to math. They are really sowing the seeds for failure because there are certain fields, you know, engineering, architectural, even a pharmaceutical area. Every area requires math.
So we were talking about, you know, obviously math being racist. You know, you think about all the STEM-based subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. By the way, these are the highest per capita incomes in our country are in these subjects.
Yes.
And oftentimes, when you look at lower socioeconomics, some people are encouraged to pursue humanity degrees and degrees like that. But the reality is that if we teach children, young people, that this is racist, they're going to miss out on a greater part of the market economy.
You know, there's been a crime against racial and ethnic minorities, and this is a crime that started at our colleges and universities. In many cases, they have set up the fields, the studies, ethnic studies, you know, black studies, Hispanic studies, women's studies, gay studies, as fields to steer certain populations into.
Yes.
And they graduate, they don't really have skills to do much. No. They're not really qualified to do the jobs where it is higher paying, and those jobs require more rigor when it
Yes.
comes to science and math and those types of fields. And many of us wondered where those people would get jobs. Well, or we said they wouldn't get jobs. Well, many of them have jobs. They're your new diversity CRT officers, and so they're going into corporations and institutions, and they're really wrecking the places because they're paid to keep division alive,
Right.
to drive people apart, and that's very dangerous. And I said I was an entrepreneur. One of the things that I did in 2020, that was the year of George Floyd's death and the riots. So we had more than 50 straight days of rioting.
Yes.
I conceived and finally executed the idea of a company, Unity Training Solutions, and it's called Carol Swain's Real Unity Training Solutions, and it's about e pluribus unum,
Yes.
uh, out of many, one, and it's based on being consistent, bringing people together, but being true to our civil rights laws of non-discrimination and equal protection, and respecting the mission of institutions, because every organization has a mission, and that mission isn't to get involved in social engineering and psychology and trying to deal with the emotional issues that people bring to the workplace
Yes.
or to the environment. That people should work together as teams. That's what we encourage them, to work together as teams and not to discriminate against anyone, and to sort of shift the focus from the divisive CRT, DEI, to unity, bringing people together around shared values and principles. And most organizations do have those principles. And so that's something that is important to me.
Yes.
And I believe that with the university system, it has failed us. And that then most universities are no longer safe places for young people, and it's not just secular universities. Many Christian universities have
Yeah.
compromised. They've drunk the Kool-Aid, and they themselves have gotten away from Judeo-Christian values and principles, because the Bible has everything that we need to
Yes.
solve our problems. And so they're bringing in Marxist concepts created by atheists, and they're sowing the seeds of conflict. You can never have racial healing and reconciliation, the brotherhood of man, the appreciation that out of one man God created all nations of men. You can't have that with CRT and DEI.
Yeah, it's truly a Marxist ideology that is hegemonic in its aim.
Right.
It's religious, it's economic, I mean, it's social. It wants to claim everything in its path,
Yes.
really. Finally, just, and you actually just touched on it, but just how we deal with this biblically. And I think you just quoted, it was Acts 17:26, out of one man came all, right? That was literally what was preached at the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17, the sermon at Mars Hill. We have to be reminded that we're created in the image of God, and that we all stand before a holy God. We have to give an account, and unless the blood of the Lamb covers us, we're not forgiven. And
That's true.
and so what CRT wants to engender in people is this idea that a certain group of people can never be forgiven, and another category of people don't need forgiveness.
One of the biggest problems, with the whole idea of critical race theory, all white people are oppressors, all minorities are victims. It says that only white people can be racist. Only white people have to engage in the work of being anti-racist. And it says that it's a permanent work, and that racism is always going to be around, and white people are always going to have to fight it. But it says that minorities are not capable of that their racism doesn't count, because they are so subservient that they are not able to commit acts of racism. And we know that some of the most racist statements and actions are made by racial and ethnic minorities against white people. There is a dangerous racial double standard. There is a violation of civil rights. There's bullying and shaming of white children, white males and females, especially if they're heterosexual, and not enough people are standing up saying, no, that's wrong. That's not who we are in America. We passed civil rights laws that ban discrimination on the account of race. That includes white people too. It's wrong to shame anyone's child. So if it's wrong to shame my child, my grandchildren, it's also wrong to shame your child and your grandchildren. That's a principle based response and
Yeah.
reaction. And so if we would just stand on principles, Judeo Christian values and principles, and the progressive left has moved away from that, and they're really harming racial and ethnic minorities as much as they're harming, probably even more than they're harming white people, because with the minorities, they are really stripping them of opportunities. Like there's certain jobs that you will never be able to
Hmm.
get unless you're proficient in math and science. And
Yes.
so you have to know math to get through algebra, to get through calculus, and to get into the higher paying STEM jobs.
Yes.
That's not going to happen if you believe math is racist, and that if you are black or Hispanic, you're going to get a different answer, and that's okay. And we have allowed a resegregation to take place,
Yeah.
like these affinity groups where they're encouraging uh, political and racial minorities to group themselves in where they feel safe.
Yes.
That's resegregation.
Yeah.
We had a civil rights movement to end segregation, and there's some colleges and universities where you can take a separate course section with your group. I
Yes.
mean, we had a civil rights movement to end that. We are going backwards in the wrong direction, and it's time for a lot of us to stand up and say no. And I can
Yes.
tell you that when it comes to fighting the battle against CRT, critical race theory, diversity, equity, inclusion, which doesn't mean diversity, equity, and inclusion, it doesn't mean what it meant 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You will find that there are a lot of racial and ethnic minorities, a lot of immigrants that are in the forefront. And unfortunately, a lot of white people have lost their voice. They're afraid to speak up.
Yeah.
And I think that's a shame. I think you have an obligation to speak up. A lot of mothers and fathers too, you know, they have begun a movement. They are speaking up, and and they own strong ground, I believe, with the Constitution. Except the America we know today, it's not clear that the Constitution, through the Department of Justice, will be honored. Will be honored when it comes to
Right.
things we've taken for granted, as far as freedom of speech, the due process, presumption of innocence,
Right.
the rule of law, that the law will be applied equally, you know, and uh, equal justice under the law. None of that stuff is guaranteed today. And I can tell you that as a Christian, um, in America, we've had it pretty easy, you know,
Yes.
over the past 200 and some years. Well, that's over.
Yeah.
To be a Bible believing Christian, it's going to cost you something. And in this new book of mine, Countercultural Living, what Jesus has to say about life, marriage, race, gender, and materialism, I sort of, it's a small book too. You can read it
Yeah.
very
I
quickly.
highly recommend it. Absolutely.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, the thing about it, I sort of use my life because I'm a person that sort of messed up. You know, like I did not have my Christian conversion experience until I was in my 40s. And when I talk about life, I'm also talking about euthanasia and physician assisted suicide and abortion. I've had an abortion in my life, my early 20s, when around the time it was first legalized. I share my story. Marriage, I can talk about what God says about marriage, the biblical view to marriage. I've had 2 divorces. If you look at me, you can see that I'm black. You look at me, I'm a female. And materialism, uh, I think we all struggle with it, but it's
Yeah.
not all about uh, the acquisition of goods. Like we think about, oh, materialistic, it's about
Yeah.
hoarding, but it can also be about other things like pride and, you know, the pursuit of fame, anything that takes you away from God. And so there's a lot going on. And I think that for Christians today, you have to be countercultural. We're living, I believe, in a post-Christian society.
Yes. Yes. I so appreciate you coming on, sharing with us all of this. Fabulous that you wrote this, Countercultural Living. what Jesus has to say about life, marriage, race, gender, and materialism. Dr. Carol Swain, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.